Yo, I'm Sigjir, and today we're going to be talking about modulators, and specifically how they can help you take something from a static loop to a living, breathing tune that changes over time in a pleasing way. So let's start off just by defining what modulators are or what modulation is in regards to music production. And I've written this definition down that modulation in music production refers to the process of changing a sound's properties over time, such as pitch, volume, or tonality. Not limited to that, but I think that's a good place to start. This can create movement and variation in a sound or on a track or in the entire piece of music. And it really can be the difference between having this static, boring loop that you get sick of and inevitably throw out, and having this moving, living thing that you call a finished track that you release or send off to a label to release or something. So let's start talking about what some different types of modulators and what's out there. The basics kind of come down to envelopes, LFOs, and random event generators. And then there are some other concepts like frequency modulation, phase modulation or phase distortion, ring modulation, amplitude modulation. I probably won't touch on those too much in this video. I think each of those deserves its own dedicated time to discuss what they are, how they work, and how using them can benefit your productions. But today I really want to dive in on the first three, which was envelopes, LFOs, and random event generators, to kind of get the parameters in your DAW moving around and bringing life to that music. So why don't we start with envelopes, and specifically something that I really like to use, which is an envelope follower. So for those who are unfamiliar, an envelope is something like this that we often see, where it has these four parameters, or maybe even just two, ADSR, which is attack, decay, sustain, and release. Now, I'm not going to dive into these parameters too much, but essentially attack is the speed at which the sound starts, decay is the speed or the rate at which the sound decays off or trails off until it's quiet again. Sustain is sustaining the, call it like an average loudness, or like almost like a quiet threshold. So in this case, this attack, the sound will ramp up and then it will decay, and it will kind of hang at this point in loudness. And release is the tail end of the sound that will fade to total silence, typically once you've released a MIDI note or stop playing a MIDI note on the piano roll. It's important to note that envelopes are triggered by MIDI events, and sometimes they can have less parameters than this. So in this case, it's ADSR. You might see attack, decay, maybe even attack, decay, sustain. I think typically it's attack, decay, or ADSR for a lot of sounds. So that's kind of like a basic envelope run through. But what I really want to discuss are these envelope followers. And what an envelope follower is it in this particular case, I'm using the Bitwig stock envelope follower, and it has this rise and fall, which is basically an attack and a decay. And I'm mapping it to this gain of this band right here, which is a high shelf. So what I'm doing here is I'm running this mid-side split EQ. I have a low cut here. So the mids, and when I'm talking about mids, I'm not talking about the middle frequencies of like 200 to 500 or whatever. I'm talking about the mono signal versus the stereo signal, the sides. So on this mid-side split, what we're doing is we are cutting out the low frequencies in the stereo space, just good mix practice. And we're using a high shelf here to boost the highs, but only for a certain period of time. And the reason why you would want to do that is because if we just turn the highs up all the time, sounds are going to bleed together, especially in this case, which this is just a full drum beat. We don't want everything to exist at the same time. We really want our sounds to exist in like this efficient puzzle piece kind of ecosystem. So without this plugin, just so you can hear the beat in context, pretty simple beat, little kind of two-step sort of thing going on there. So if we turn this mid-side split on, I will show you, you'll see this, go full screen here. You'll see this band here, this high shelf will start jumping. So what's happening here is that we're boosting the highs. Really, it's a pretty soft cue on the curve. So like 1K and up starts getting boosted around maybe let's call it like 6 to 8 dB range. Other than just showing you what's happening and telling you that it's good, the reason why this can be good for something, one, a high shelf on sound is typically going to brighten it up if it's not being overdone, in which case it would be like harsh and you would hurt your ears and you wouldn't like it anyways. And then in this given context on this drum beat, a lot of the transients and the clarity kind of exist in these higher frequencies. You could go in here and add like these really specific peaks, like maybe there might be like a or a snare fundamental in here. Yeah, so like I could map the envelope follower to that peak right there, that bell curve, and then have it jump up and really push the fundamental up. In this case, I'm really just kind of bringing some extra brightness and clarity to the beat. So without it, it's kind of stagnant. It's not bad. It's not terrible, but it just doesn't feel like it's. I don't feel like I'm in a room with it. And then when it's on, it's a subtle difference. I've noticed with really good sound design or really good mix downs, you don't really tend to just jump out and notice things that are done well. They're almost done so well and they're so subtle that you really just dislike it when they're gone. So subtlety is kind of the key here in this particular use. And then just to show you that always, I mean, if you have a DAW where you can use envelope followers, the stock options, that's great. Some plugins have them built in. So in this case, something else that I like to do is use saturator like FabFilter Saturn 2. And in this case, they actually have built-in envelope followers that you can map to the parameters inside of the plugin. So I've just done that here. All this is a multiband saturation. I'm not actually doing anything on the low band. That's just like the low sub of the kick. I like having sub in my drums so that you get some punch and some feeling out of it. And then really the rest is just this saturation happening on everything from like the top of the kick, the body, like not the part that you'd feel, but like the part of the kick that you would actually hear, and then the snare and all the hats and stuff. And you'll see this, really what I'm doing is I'm mapping this envelope follower here to the drive knob or the gain of this particular band of saturation. And again, we're just doing, actually it's a pretty quick, so yeah, you can see this envelope follower. There's just there's an attack and a decay or a release in this particular case. And that's mapped to this drive knob. And so when we play this drum beat, you'll see this drive knob kind of jumping, and it's only saturating when a sound is peaking hard enough to trigger the saturation. So this purple arced meter right here, that's the envelope follower pushing the drive up on the saturation. So let's turn it off and we'll just A/B and hear the difference. There's a little bit more information in the middle frequency space, not the mids, but the middle frequencies and also the high frequencies. So again, these are things that can take your your sounds from dull and static to something alive, living and breathing, so to speak. The next thing that I want to dive into is LFOs, and I really can't overstate the importance of not only understanding what you can do with LFOs, but how powerful they really are, especially tools where you can draw custom shapes. To give you some examples, there's some pretty basic ones that we're going to run through here, but then there's really complex things you can do, like very, very smart sidechain options or sound design things where you can design this crazy sound or this really gritty bass, but then you can carve it out and have it perfectly fit your kick at the same time without adding any extra plugins. It's all just like really slick sound design with LFOs. So why don't we start by picking this sound apart. And I'll just run through this patch real quick. This isn't a bass design tutorial, so I'm not really going to break this down too much. But yeah, so if we this first LFO, this is actually, technically, this is just an envelope. This is to add some clean stereo width and serum. When I say clean, I mean like phase locked. So typically if you just turn this detune knob up, you'll see that the sound doesn't start the same way every time, and it's because there's voices of unison moving around. When you have this envelope mode on, it just starts it the same way every time, but also includes the stereo width. So that's what I mean by clean or safe unison, which in a bass we wouldn't want the low end to be randomized unless we were bouncing it to audio or something where it would then be static. So we have this second envelope set up here with this kind of pluck ramp tail shape. And what we're actually doing is using an LFO in free mode. So if it's in retrigger, every time I play a MIDI note, the LFO will happen, but it'll retrigger every time I'm playing the MIDI note. If I have it in free mode, it will cycle in at whatever rate. In this case, it's 4 bars, but it will cycle independent of me playing a MIDI note. So I could hit a MIDI note and it could trigger halfway or more than halfway through the LFO. And sometimes that's good for sounds that don't need to be like quantized or locked into the grid of the DAW per se. So if we look at this envelope real quick, actually just moving an EQ apparently. Yeah, okay, so there's a cutoff here on this low pass filter. But the low pass filter is not really what is the most interesting part here. The interesting part is this kind of pulse wave or square wave LFO, which we could probably make even more interesting if we just make it a sine wave instead. And we can just invert it. And essentially what this is doing, you see all these LFO buses. What that is, it's all these different points. In this case, this is even like the curve of the line between the 2 points in the LFO. And it's just moving them on the x-axis and the y-axis to change the shape of the LFO. And by changing the shape of the LFO, we're actually affecting the rate or the speed at which the low pass filter cutoff is moving. And so it sounds like I'm potentially playing 2 different basses or maybe even 2 different notes, but it's just an LFO changing the way the behavior of this envelope that gives it character. So let's hear it. Right. And if we turn it off, it's not terrible, but it's just the same thing. And while it might be interesting right now, is that interesting enough to play for 4 minutes? I don't think so. That being said, with this LFO that changes the character of this, I also probably wouldn't like it for 4 minutes, but I could tolerate the sound longer because it's not the same exact sound playing every time. So that's a kind of a more basic approach to LFOs and how they can work. I think another approach, this would be in the context of something more musical or melodic, like a pad. You can use LFOs to, yeah. So in this case, we're using an LFO to change the pitch, very subtly change the pitch of this synth. This is just kind of like a saw pad sound. But one of the things when people talk about analog warmth or they refer to just the classic character of these analog synths, really I think what they're grasping at is that these synths tend to have subtle imperfections that are actually very pleasing. Like for instance, a lot of them have some noise naturally that runs through the signal with whatever sound you're making, or pitch instability where like we're not talking about, while it could jump a semitone or something like more than the semitone, talking about fractions of the semitone, maybe even like less than a quarter of a semitone. But that instability just has the sound move a little bit, and that movement is what so, and that's what we're doing in this case. I'm using this sine LFO, not in BPM mode. In this case, it's in hertz because I really wanted this to be organic. And in my opinion, when I want something to be organic, I want it to exist independent of the grid or quantization in the DAW. So yeah, in this case, it's a bipolar LFO, meaning that it goes on the context of the pitch. It's moving left and right, which means it's going up 1 semitone and also down 1 semitone from its root note. And in the case of this noise oscillator, it's just adding gain and taking gain away, just to kind of emulate the hiss and the pitch instability. of a sound. So let's hear the pad, and then we'll kind of break it down from there. And I forgot there's also some side chaining on here. Let's just check that out. Okay, so we have our pitch instability LFO. We also have actually a very similar same sine wave LFO, but at a different rate, a much slower rate. And that is just moving the cutoff to a filter. I believe I'm doing anything on the effects here. Yeah, so in this case, we're really just creating this instability where we're sort of adding and removing some high frequencies by a low pass filter. We are creating some pitch and noise instability. And then you can also see here this odd shape. This is what I was talking about when it comes to like more slick or like forward thinking sound design approach. It's not to me at least. I don't really consider like really forward thinking futuristic sound design adding 50 instances of OTT and then bouncing it and seeing what happens. That can sometimes be cool. I typically don't do it, but using the least amount of processing to get the best possible result is what something that I really appreciate in music. And in this case, we're using this LFO to create ducking or sidechain. So if we turn it off, it's just a straight pad. When we turn it on, we start to hear that ducking, that pumping. And the reason why that's there is because it's allowing space for the drums to come through now. And that's all just by taking an LFO in retrigger mode because I want it to keep happening every time, at least as long as the note's being played. And in this case, you could turn the gain all the way down and then draw the shape inverted, but I'm just taking the gain knobs at its default position of 75%, and I'm pulling it down. So when this LFO is turned, or when the shape is all the way up, volume is turned all the way down. So sometimes you have to kind of think about it, and I actually like to vocalize what I'm doing. Otherwise, sometimes you get lost in the sauce and it's confusing about like, how am I applying this to what parameter and what is it actually doing? So sometimes just say it out loud and work through it. And if it makes sense when you say it out loud, then it probably makes sense and just do it. There's really no rules on how to, I'm not going to say, oh, if you want to sidechain with an LFO, you have to do it this way. You could do the same thing. You could, turn this down, turn this up, and then all of a sudden, you have this, you'd have to invert the shape of this, but you'd have the same sidechain. In this case, you might have like a stab kind of thing. It's not bad. It's interesting. It's not really going to fit the context of what I'm trying to show here, but just goes to show you. Yeah, you can play around with these things and use LFOs to solve problems that usually you would use like a compressor for or something else. So yeah, now you can hear it with this drum beat where we're sidechaining the pad to the drums. And when it's not there, it's kind of a mess. It gets lost, but we turn it back on. There you go. Now the kick is kind of more present, and that's all just with the LFO. It's before we've added any kind of post-processing to deal with sidechain and stuff. That being said, I also want to talk about this is kind of like a fake LFO that I've set up, and this is an LFO that is kind of doing what amplitude modulation would be doing. So to break this down in a simplistic way, this is just a sine wave, this AM modulator. Because in this case, when we're getting into things like frequency modulation, amplitude modulation, phase distortion, phase modulation, you're going to have two elements. You could have more, but you're going to have a carrier, which is the root sound. You want to think about it, it's like the sound that you actually hear, and then you have a modulator, and that's a sound or a signal that's doing something to the sound that you hear. It's a very basic version of that because you can then also turn up the modulator sound and kind of add them together, and that sort of loses the plot of what I'm trying to communicate here. But point being is that this is just a sine wave. And if you're not on something that has some low end response, like with a sub or some good headphones, you might not even hear this. But just know that when we take a sine wave and we play them at lower frequencies, they move a lot slower. So the effect of the amplitude modulation is a lot more noticeable on a sound. If we speed it up, eventually it'll be so fast that you don't really hear it, and you might just hear the extra tonal results or something. But in this case, I wanted this kind of like slow amplitude modulation that almost sounds like really shitty distortion in your car. Like if you turn something up too loud and it kind of rattles the speakers too much, but they're like not good, like you don't have a sub in the car. It's like not really supposed to be pushed that far. I like to describe it as like a fake distortion. Let's break this down. So we have this sine wave that's being played. And on this case, I'm just using a tool. If you're in Ableton, it's a utility. In FL Studio, it could be a fruity send, but there's just a gain knob here. I'm using this audio rate, which is just like an audio input. So it's essentially reading the signal from the modulator. And then I'm using this macro. This macro is just mapped to the gain knob. So as I turn this mix knob up, I will be applying this amplitude modulation, let's call it. But really, all we're doing is using sine wave LFO to modulate the gain of this knob. And as I turn this up, you'll start to hear the sound get crunchy, I guess is a way to describe it. And that's all just with an LFO in this case, or a sine wave. You might be wondering if you don't like that sound, you might be wondering why would I ever want to do that? Well, typically you can get a cleaner, louder mix. You can find ways to mimic distortion without actually distorting things. So in this case, I've created this kind of distorted, crunchy sound without actually distorting it, and it's peaking at 12 dB. So if that's the goal, if the goal is to make something sound distorted without turning up a bunch of stuff and distorting it, I have all this headroom. I could probably saturate it even further past this point, and it's probably still going to work in my mix. So it's a pretty safe, non-destructive approach to faking distortion or creating distortion. Now, something else that I want to cover, these random event generators or random modulators. In this case, I have this kind of percussive sound, and it sounds like this. Now, this is using some phase distortion. In this case, oscillator A, the sine wave, would be the carrier. Oscillator B would be the modulator. So this kind of weird, almost soft clipped saw wave is modulating the sine wave. I have some noise in there just for character, running it through this formant filter to kind of give it some tonal changes, and then some quick processing, downsample distortion just to make it sound more robotic, some stereo width, chorus for stereo width, and the rest is just mixing choices. Where things get really interesting here are not only just the LFOs that are kind of shaping things, but we have these random event generators. And I think so in Serum 1, they were referred to as chaos oscillators. I think they improved upon that and gave you like multiple options now, but I suppose they're still chaos oscillators or chaos LFOs. You might see these weird shapes and say like, well, what is this and what's happening here? Basically, what you need to know is that you have these options for these different. Normal is just like the regular behavior of an LFO or an envelope, but you have these chaos oscillators and this sample and hold, which sort of just creates this storm of when or how an event actually happens. So in this case, I have the rate of LFO1 and the rate of LFO2 are being randomly modulated. So you'll see that this knob will jump around a bit, and it actually gives it the character because this is kind of like it's an LFO and it's in retrigger mode, so it's behaving like an LFO, but it's acting like an attack decay envelope, like a really short pluck. And then this one is kind of like a longer pluck that applies to the gain of the sound and the volume of the sound. This is sort of tonally shaping the sound. But if we listen to this without these on, and I'll turn off our other random LFO as well, or random generator, it's this sound. Which is interesting. It's got character, but once we turn this on, kind of comes to life a little bit more. It sounds more like percussive in a way that eventually will tie back into this beat that we made initially. And then to touch on the second random event generator, this one is basically just changing the start position of these three knobs. So this bend plus minus, this warp mode on oscillator B, which in turn is changing the tone of oscillator A because we're using phase distortion. And then this formant filter, we're sort of changing where these resonant peaks are starting at each time. So it's not always the same spot. So without it, it sounds like this. And then with it, it sounds like this. Again, it's something that's very subtle. It's subtle, but ultimately, it is keeping the sound in the same vein of what I want it to be, but slightly changing it so that you're not just getting bored and sick of the sound, and it's not going from something musically pleasing to like just ear torture. And then yeah, let's listen to it with this drum beat just to show that these techniques can be used in any way with any plugin. Like once you understand what you're trying to do, it's just a matter of what plugins you want to use. This is just a utility or tool with the volume knob here, and we have an LFO, and it is just mapping, and it's mapped to this volume knob, and it's pulling the gain down, acting like a sidechain again. So it's creating space for that kick and that snare to come through. So why don't we listen to both of these combined? Right, so now we kind of have this full beat with this robotic percussion sounding thing, and the LFOs do give it some character. I have some LFOs that are moving more slowly that just kind of create these tonal changes that are mapped to like the distortion and then the where the bands of the EQ or the filters are setting. But ultimately, I mean, this stuff is coming from these random event generators. So yeah, some things I probably wouldn't use random event generators on low end of bass unless your goal is to generate a bunch of things and bounce that to audio and then save that as like your own sample library. Because once it's in audio, it's a little bit safer to use there. But yeah, and anything that we're not trying to like protect the integrity of, like low end, where like we really need it to be there and present the whole time in our mix. I think this is a great tool to use to sort of bring things to life and create little imperfections. And you could even argue, once you get away from like club system electronic music, like a real drummer isn't hitting the snare the same exact way every time. There's ghost snares and flams and all these techniques, same deal with a kick or a cymbal. And it's those imperfections that really make something feel alive and give it the character that it needs. So just to sum all of this up, we can probably play all this together, and I'm willing to bet it works. This is all just the combination of envelopes, LFOs, carefully designed shapes. So, these custom shapes. Here's another good example. So this is Shaper Box 3 with just a volume shaper on it. And this is just a sidechain, but essentially this would be, I guess, an LFO because it's reading an audio signal, but it's envelope, whatever you want to call it. But I'm just using this custom shape here to sort of carve out a sidechain here, or ducking. It's ducking a little bit more for the lows so that the kick and the snare can come through, and then it's pulling the mids and the highs down, but not quite as much. And I don't think I'm doing anything post processing wise on anything else. Some of this stuff is just character. This is just a convolution reverb for some tail and a disperser for some more phase interest. But yeah, I mean, that's it. That sounds horrible. Why don't we turn the pad off? Maybe with the pad. I have the macro up still. Yeah, so those are some ways that I use envelope followers or envelope LFOs, and really stressing that the envelope or the LFO kind of depends on the situation and the thing you're trying to do. But the really important part is the shaping of it, whether it's using a simple shape to create like an imperfection, or a controlled instability in the sound, like having the pitch kind of drift slightly out of key, or you know, having like some real custom shape drawn for side chaining, or adding in overtones at a given moment in time and backing off. Play around with this stuff, experiment with it. I don't really think there's a wrong way to approach any of this. Keep the context of the mix in mind. Obviously, don't just turn things up because they sound good by themselves. Check them in the context of everything else, and play around with these random event generators. Create some instabilities. Bounce it to audio. Don't bounce it to audio. The only downside with this is that it's random, so sometimes you might get a really really good variation or version that you like, but it might be gone after that because the probability of recreating the events again are kind of slim. But that's why I like to, when I do map these parameters, typically I try to do them in very small increments so that the change isn't so drastic that I'm just kind of losing it, hearing it once and then losing it after that. But yeah, that's how I like to go about working with and applying modulators to sounds. Um, Again, there'll probably be dedicated videos for FM, especially like FM synthesis and phase modulation or phase distortion synthesis, and ring modulation and amplitude modulation. So I hope this helps, and yeah, start modulating. Get parameters moving, and yeah, I hope that kind of, maybe that takes you from that frustrated loop that you're about to throw out to sparking some more ideas, and then you finish a tune or something like that. So good luck, and if you have any questions, feel free to, you can DM me or drop a comment or whatever, and don't forget to like and subscribe, all that stuff. See ya.